Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I didn't come to entertain your ears, I came to wake up your spirit. I came to speak to every person who has been smiling on the outside while fighting battles in the mind on the inside. Because sometimes the greatest enemy in your life is not the people around you, it's the voice within you. Before 2026 arrives, some things cannot go with us. The fear cannot go, the doubt cannot go, the shame cannot go. The story that says you are not enough, not ready, not chosen, not capable, that story must end here. You cannot step into a new year with an old mindset. You cannot expect fresh blessings while feeding dead thoughts. And you cannot build a powerful future while agreeing with the lies that tried to break you. Tonight is your notice. Your negative thinking has an expiration date. Your excuses have an expiration date. Your self-sabotage has an expiration date. So as we begin, I need you to ask yourself one question. If the only thing standing between me and my next level is the way I think, am I ready to change my mind and change my life? Your thoughts are either building your future or burying it in ways you don't even notice in the moment. Because thoughts are not just passing ideas, they are seeds. And every seed you allow to stay in your mind long enough will eventually grow into something you have to live with. That is why what you think in private becomes the reality you experience in public. People often look at outcomes and assume they came out of nowhere, but the truth is, outcomes are usually the loudest expression of a quiet internal conversation that has been happening for a long time. When your mind is constantly rehearsing failure, rejection, and disappointment, you are not just thinking, you are training yourself to expect less, to try less, and to believe less. And without realizing it, you start making decisions that align with those beliefs. You hesitate when you should move. You step back when you should step forward. You that remain silent when you should speak, not because you lack ability, but because your thinking has been shaping your interpretation of what is possible for you. That is how thoughts begin to build ceilings over your life that were never meant to be there. On the other hand, when your thoughts are grounded in possibility, growth, and faith in your capacity to rise, something powerful begins to shift in your behavior. You still face challenges, but you don't interpret them as final verdicts. You see them as temporary resistance. You still feel fear, but you don't surrender to it. You still experience doubt, but you don't let it become the loudest voice in your mind. Your thoughts begin to build momentum instead of limitations. They start constructing a future that your current circumstances have not yet caught up with. The challenge is that most people underestimate the quiet power of repetition in thinking. A single negative thought may not seem dangerous, but a repeated negative thought becomes a belief. And a belief is no longer something you question, it becomes something you obey. That is why people can be capable of greatness but still live in smallness, because their thoughts have been rehearsing limitation for so long that expansion feels uncomfortable. And anything that feels uncomfortable, they tend to avoid, even if it is exactly what they need to grow. Your future is not just waiting on opportunities, it is responding to your internal dialogue. The way you speak to yourself when no one is around is shaping the way you show up when everyone is watching. If your mind is constantly telling you that you are behind, unworthy, or not enough, then even when opportunities come, you will filter them through insecurity instead of confidence. You will question what you deserve instead of recognizing what you are capable of receiving. That is how thoughts quietly become barriers. But the same principle works in reverse. When you begin to intentionally guard your thoughts, you are protecting your mental space and preventing unwanted ideas from entering your mind. Challenge negativity and redirect your internal narrative. You begin to reshape the direction of your life. It does not happen instantly, and it does not happen without resistance, because your mind will always try to return to familiar patterns. But consistency in thought eventually becomes consistency in action, and consistency in action becomes transformation in reality. What you think repeatedly, you eventually live repeatedly, and what you believe deeply, you eventually become aligned with. That is why your thoughts are not something to be ignored or entertained lightly. They are forming the framework of your future in real time. Every time you choose to dwell in negativity, you are reinforcing a version of your life that you may not actually want. And every time you choose to challenge that negativity, you are quietly building something stronger. Something more aligned with who you are meant to become. Negative thinking is not your identity, it's a habit you must break, even though it often feels like it is who you are. The most dangerous thing about negative thinking is not just what it makes you feel in the moment, but what it convinces you to believe about yourself over time. It starts quietly, almost unnoticed, like a reaction to disappointment, a response to fear, or a memory of something that once hurt you. But if it is not challenged, it becomes familiar. And once it becomes familiar, it starts to feel like truth. Many people don't realize they are practicing negative thinking every day. It shows up in the way they anticipate failure before they even begin. It shows up in how they interpret neutral situations as rejection or temporary setbacks as permanent defeat. It shows up in the inner commentary that says, "This won't work, I'm not good enough, or people like me don't succeed." And over time, these thoughts stop feeling like passing ideas and start feeling like facts. But they are not facts, they are patterns that have been rehearsed long enough to feel believable. What makes negative thinking so powerful is repetition. The mind learns through repetition. Whatever you expose your mind to consistently becomes your default setting. If your internal dialogue has been shaped by fear, criticism, comparison, or past failure, then you may be experiencing a negative self-talk. Then your mind will naturally lean in that direction even when there is no real evidence to support it in the present moment. That is why two people can face the same situation and interpret it completely differently. One sees opportunity while the other sees threat. One sees growth while the other sees limitation. The difference is not the situation, it is the habit of thinking. But here is what you must understand. Habits can be broken, even deeply rooted mental habits. Just because your mind has learned to think negatively does not mean it has to stay that way. You are not locked into every thought that passes through your mind. You are not obligated to agree with everything your mind suggests. There is a space between a thought appearing and you accepting it, and that space is where transformation begins. Breaking the habit of negative thinking requires awareness first. You cannot change what you refuse to notice. Most people live on autopilot, allowing thoughts to run unchecked, rehearsing worst-case scenarios without even questioning their validity. But the moment you start observing your thoughts instead of obeying them, something shifts. You begin to realize that not every thought deserves your agreement. Not every internal voice deserves your trust. Then comes the discipline of replacement. You cannot simply remove negative thinking and expect emptiness to fix itself. The mind does not respond well to voids. It needs direction. So when a negative thought arises, it must be challenged, not entertained. It must be replaced with something grounded in truth, not emotion. This is not about pretending everything is perfect. It is about refusing to let temporary feelings dictate permanent beliefs. Negative thinking also thrives in isolation. It grows stronger when it is unspoken, unchallenged, and unexamined. That is why it often feels louder when you are alone. But when you begin to bring awareness to it, speak against it, and refuse to normalize it, its power begins to weaken. What once felt like identity slowly starts to reveal itself as conditioning, and what is learned can be unlearned. You also begin to realize that negative thinking is often protective in disguise. It convinces you that it is trying to keep you safe by lowering your expectations, avoiding disappointment, or preventing failure. But in reality, it is also preventing growth, opportunity, and progress. It keeps you in familiar territory, even if that territory is limiting. And while comfort may feel safe, it often becomes the very thing that restricts expansion. As you begin to break this habit, you may notice resistance. Your mind may push back, especially when you try to think differently in situations that used to trigger negativity automatically. That resistance is not a sign that you are failing, it is a sign that you are changing. Old patterns do not dissolve quietly. They react before they release. But consistency in choosing new thoughts gradually rewires what once felt automatic over time. What once felt like a natural reaction becomes a conscious choice. You stop defaulting to worst-case scenarios. You stop agreeing with every fear that enters your mind. You stop interpreting your life through a lens of limitation. And slowly, the habit of negative thinking begins to lose its grip, not because life becomes perfect, but because your mind becomes trained to see beyond what used to control it. You cannot walk into a new season with an old mindset, because a new season will always expose what your mind has not yet surrendered. People often pray for change in their life, but they underestimate how much their thinking must shift to sustain that change. You can step into new, taught, opportunities, new environments, and new doors, but if your mindset remains unchanged, you will interpret new experiences through old limitations. And that is how people end up standing and answer prayers while still feeling stuck, because physically they move forward, but mentally they stayed behind. A new season is not just a change in circumstances, it is a demand for a change in perception. What used to make sense in your last season may no longer serve you in the next. The way you used to think about yourself, your abilities, your worth, and your future must evolve if you are going to recognize and handle what is ahead of you. Because every season carries its own level of responsibility, and your mindset determines whether you rise to meet it or shrink to avoid it. When your mindset is old, even new blessings feel uncomfortable. You begin to question what you prayed for. You start second-guessing opportunities that require confidence you have not yet developed internally. You hesitate in rooms you were meant to own, not because you are unqualified, but because your thinking has not expanded to match the space you now occupy. That mismatch creates internal conflict, where your environment is speaking growth, but your mind is still speaking survival. An old mindset is often shaped by past experiences, failures, disappointments, rejections, and moments where things did not work out the way you expected. And if those experiences are not processed properly, they become filters through which you see everything new. So even when something good arrives, your mind scans it for danger instead of possibility. Even when people show you trust, your mind searches for betrayal. Even when doors open, your mind assumes they will eventually close. That is not discernment, that is unhealed thinking trying to navigate a new chapter. To walk into a new season, you must be willing to release old interpretations of yourself. You are not who you were in the last season, even if your mind still tries to convince you otherwise. Growth requires you to update your self-perception. If you continue to see yourself through outdated definitions, you will limit how far you allow yourself to go. And many people are not stuck because life has stopped moving, but because their identity has not caught up with where life is trying to take them. An old mindset also resists discomfort, but new seasons are often uncomfortable at first. They require unfamiliar decisions, unfamiliar risks, and unfamiliar levels of confidence. If your mind is still trained to avoid discomfort at all costs, it will interpret growth as danger. And anything interpreted as danger will be avoided, even if it is necessary for your evolution. That is how people sabotage their own advancement while believing they are simply being cautious. But transformation requires willingness to think differently, even when it feels unnatural. It requires the courage to question thoughts that used to feel automatic. It requires the humility to admit that the way you used to think may no longer be sufficient for where you are going. Because if your thinking does not stretch, your life will not expand, no matter how many opportunities are placed in front of you. There is also a grief that comes with letting go of an old mindset. It is familiar, even if it is limiting. It feels like protection, even if it is restriction. And letting go of it can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you are really losing is not your identity, it is the limitation that has been masquerading as identity. And what you are gaining is capacity. Capacity to see differently, respond differently, and become someone your old thinking could never fully support. A new season will always require new thinking, because life does not evolve in isolation from mindset. They move together. And if one refuses to grow, the other will eventually feel restricted. That is why you can no longer afford to romanticize old patterns of thinking just because they are familiar. Familiarity is not always alignment. Sometimes it is just repetition without growth. And repetition without growth will always keep you cycling through the same outcomes. Even when the calendar changes and the opportunities shift, what you consistently believe about yourself will eventually shape your reality, even when your circumstances seem to suggest otherwise in the beginning. Belief is not just a quiet thought sitting in the background of your mind. It is the invisible force that influences how you interpret everything that happens to you. It determines how you respond to opportunities, how you handle challenges, and how you define your worth in moments when life does not give you immediate validation. Over time, belief becomes the lens through which you see yourself, and that lens will either expand your life or restrict it. Most people underestimate how much their internal beliefs are shaping their external experiences. They think their life is only being shaped by effort, talent, or opportunity, but beneath all of that is belief directing the outcome. Two people can have the same level of skill, the same opportunity, and even the same environment, yet their results can be completely different because what they believe about themselves silently influences their actions. One moves with confidence because they believe they are capable, while the other hesitates because they believe they are not enough. And those small differences in behavior eventually lead to very different outcomes. Belief works quietly but consistently. It does not need constant attention to operate. Once it is established, it begins to automate your responses. If you consistently believe that you are someone who fails, your mind will begin to interpret setbacks as confirmation of that belief. You will start to notice evidence that supports it and ignore evidence that contradicts it. If you believe you are someone who is capable, your mind will begin to interpret challenges as opportunities for growth instead of proof of limitation. That is how belief filters reality without you even realizing it. The challenge is that many beliefs are formed early, often through experiences that were never properly processed. A single moment of rejection can create a belief of unworthiness. A repeated pattern of failure can create a belief of inadequacy. A lack of encouragement can create a belief that you are not capable. And once these beliefs are formed, they begin to operate silently in the background, influencing decisions long after the original experience has passed. You may no longer remember the moment that created the belief, but you are still living under its influence. What makes belief so powerful is that it does not just reflect your reality, it actively participates in creating it. When you believe something about yourself, you begin to act in alignment with that belief, often without realizing it. If you believe you are not qualified, you may avoid applying for opportunities. If you believe you are not worthy, you may tolerate less than you deserve. If you believe you are capable, you may step into spaces you once avoided. And those actions, repeated over time, become the structure of your life. Changing your reality, therefore, requires more than changing your circumstances. It requires changing the beliefs that are producing your current behavior. Because if the belief remains unchanged, the behavior will eventually return to its default pattern, even if there is temporary improvement. That is why people can experience short-term success but struggle to sustain it, because the internal belief system was never fully aligned with the new level they stepped into. Belief is also deeply connected to identity. What you believe about yourself becomes who you think you are, and who you think you are determines what you allow yourself to do. If your identity is rooted in limitation, you will unconsciously resist anything that challenges that identity, even if it is good for you. But if your identity begins to shift toward possibility, you will start to tolerate discomfort in ways you previously avoided, because your belief system now supports growth instead of restriction. The transformation of belief is not always immediate. It is often a gradual process of replacing repeated thoughts, challenging long-held assumptions, and choosing new interpretations of old experiences. It requires consistency because belief is not built in a single moment, it is built through repetition over time. Every time you choose a thought that aligns with possibility instead of limitation, you open yourself up to new possibilities. You are slowly reshaping what you believe to be true about yourself. Eventually, what you consistently believe begins to feel like reality, not because reality has changed first, but because your perception of reality has been reshaped to match your belief system. And once that shift happens, your actions, decisions, and expectations begin to align with a new version of yourself that was always possible, but previously hidden beneath the weight of limiting beliefs. Fear loses power when you stop agreeing with it, because fear does not survive on truth alone, it survives on your agreement. Fear is not always loud or dramatic. Most of the time, it is subtle, logical, and convincing. It does not always tell you to stop completely. Sometimes it simply suggests that you wait, that you are not ready yet, that the timing is not right, or that failure is too risky. And if you are not careful, you begin to confuse fear's voice with wisdom, when in reality, it is often just uncertainty dressed up as caution. Fear grows stronger the more you entertain it. The moment a fearful thought enters your mind, it begins to gain influence if you start negotiating with it. You start imagining worst-case scenarios. You start rehearsing outcomes that have not happened. You start building internal arguments for why you should not move forward. And in doing so, you give fear more space than it actually deserves. It does not need permission to appear, but it does need permission to lead, and that permission is often given silently through agreement. When you agree with fear, even subtly, you begin to shrink your actions to match its limitations. You avoid conversations you should have. You delay decisions that require courage. You step back from opportunities that demand visibility. And over time, your life begins to reflect the boundaries that fear has drawn, not because those boundaries are real, but because they were accepted internally. Fear becomes powerful not through force, but through repetition of consent. But the moment you stop agreeing with fear, something shifts internally. Fear may still appear, but it no longer has authority. You begin to recognize it as a reaction rather than a command. You start to see it as a signal of unfamiliarity, not a prediction of failure. And that shift in interpretation changes everything about how you respond to it. Instead of retreating, you begin to pause, observe, and then proceed anyway. That is where fear begins to lose its control. Disagreement with fear does not mean the absence of fear. It means the refusal to let fear dictate your decisions. You can feel fear and still move forward. You can acknowledge uncertainty and still take action. You can recognize risk and still choose growth. Courage is not the elimination of fear, it is the decision to act without its approval. And every time you act without fear's agreement, you weaken its influence over your life. Fear also relies heavily on imagination. It uses your ability to visualize to create scenarios that have not happened yet. It projects failure into the future and then asks you to respond to that projection as if it were reality. But imagination is not meant to serve fear, it is meant to serve possibility. When you stop agreeing with fear, you begin to redirect your imagination toward outcomes that support growth instead of limitation. You start to visualize what could go right instead of obsessing over what could go wrong. There is also a pattern that develops when fear is consistently challenged: resilience. Every time you move forward despite fear, you prove to yourself that fear is not absolute truth. You gather evidence that you can survive discomfort, uncertainty, and risk. And that evidence begins to accumulate, slowly rewriting your internal response system. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once felt paralyzing begins to feel temporary. And what once felt like a stop sign begins to feel like a signal to proceed with awareness. Fear loses its authority when it is no longer treated as the final decision maker. It can still offer its opinion, but it no longer controls the outcome. You begin to separate feeling from fact, emotion from instruction, and hesitation from direction. That separation is where freedom begins to form, because you are no longer reacting automatically to every fearful thought that enters your mind. Over time, as you continue to stop agreeing with fear, your identity begins to shift. You start to see yourself as someone who can move forward even in uncertainty, someone who does not require perfect conditions to take action, someone who understands that fear may be present, but it does not define the path ahead. And in that shift, fear gradually loses its place as the dominant voice guiding your decisions before 2026. Your mind must be renewed, not just your goals, because goals alone cannot carry a mind that is still operating in old patterns. Many people rush into new seasons with new plans, new visions, and new resolutions, but they overlook the deeper requirement for transformation, which is the renewal of thought. You can change your calendar, you can change your strategy, you can even change your environment, but if your thinking remains untouched, you will eventually find yourself recreating the same imitations in a different setting. Renewal is not cosmetic, it is foundational. The mind is where everything begins long before it becomes visible in your life. Every decision, every hesitation, every act of courage or fear is first processed through the mind. That is why without mental renewal, external change becomes temporary at best. You may experience short bursts of progress, but without a renewed mind, you will naturally drift back to familiar thought patterns that feel safe, even if they are limiting. The mind always seeks what it recognizes, not necessarily what is best for you. And if what it recognizes is fear, doubt, and lack, it will repeatedly guide you back to those places. To renew your mind means to question what you have accepted without interrogation. It means challenging the thoughts that have been living in your mental space for years without being confronted. Thoughts like "I am not enough," "I will always struggle," or "people like me don't succeed" are not just passing ideas, they are mental frameworks that shape how you interpret your entire life. And if they are not renewed, they will continue to dictate your responses even when your circumstances improve. Renewal also requires awareness of repetition. The mind does not change through occasional inspiration, it changes through consistent exposure to new truth. Whatever you repeatedly think about becomes your default perception. That is why, even when you hear something empowering, if your internal dialogue remains unchanged, you will eventually return to your original mindset. Renewal is not about hearing something once, it is about replacing what has been repeated for years with something healthier, stronger, and more aligned with where you are going. There is also a tension that comes with renewal because the mind does not surrender old thinking easily. It resists change, especially when that change challenges long-held beliefs about identity and capability. Even when those beliefs are limiting, they feel familiar, and familiarity often feels like safety. So when you begin the process of renewing your mind, you may experience discomfort, resistance, or even internal conflict. Old thoughts will try to reassert themselves, reminding you of past failures or past limitations, as if your future is obligated to repeat your history. But renewal requires interruption. It requires you to stop agreeing with every thought that enters your mind and start evaluating whether those thoughts deserve authority. Not every thought is truth, and not every fear is prophecy. Some thoughts are just echoes of past experiences trying to shape your future. And if you do not interrupt those echoes, they will continue to sound like direction even when they are only repetition. As your mind begins to renew, your perception of possibility begins to expand. You start to see options where you once saw dead ends. You start to recognize opportunities that were always present but previously invisible to your thinking. Renewal does not always change your external world immediately, but it changes your internal interpretation of that world, and that shift alone begins to alter the way you move through life. You also begin to notice that renewed thinking produces renewed behavior. When your mind is no longer anchored in limitation, your actions begin to reflect possibility. You start to take steps that you once delayed. You start to speak with more confidence. You start to make decisions without the same level of internal resistance. And those small shifts begin to accumulate into noticeable transformation over time. But renewal is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process of alignment, correction, and intentional redirection. It requires you to consistently return your mind to truth when it drifts back toward fear. It requires you to actively choose new thoughts, even when old ones feel more comfortable. And it requires patience because mental transformation often happens quietly. Before it becomes visible externally, before 2026 arrives, the most important shift will not just be in what you pursue, but in how you think about what you pursue. Because a renewed mind does not just chase goals, it interprets life differently, responds differently, and expects differently. And that expectation begins to reshape everything around you in ways you are still becoming aware of as your thinking continues to evolve and stretch into spaces it has not yet fully stepped into.